Hello, YouTube land. This is brentonsawin coming to you from Lexington, Kentucky, the Bluegrass State. Before we get started today, if anyone out there has a story that they would like to share here on the show, it could be cryptid, supernatural, paranormal, anything that's an interesting story, we'd be glad to talk to you here on this show. And if anyone wants to contribute at the beginning of the year, I can certainly use contributions. You can go to a link in the description, PayPal me. It's really easy to use, and I appreciate every contribution that I receive. Now, today's guest is Scott Carpenter, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and his new book that he has, and another book on the way. And so sit tight and enjoy this show. It's going to be fascinating. Hello, Scott.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great, man. I've been wanting to get you on, and I know that you're busy, and you're always working on something, working on something. So, but now we finally got this put together. And you have a book out, but you have another book on the way. So if you would, I'd like for you to give a introduction to yourself, a little bio, and then and kind of mention your books there, and then we'll go from there, if you would.
Sure. Of course, I live in East Tennessee, not too far from the Smoky Mountains and all the different lakes and rivers and wild places to go. It's a good place to live. And about 6-7 years ago, I had an experience an odd experience while fishing, and that led me into starting I guess you would call the amateur Bigfoot research. And then I started down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and I went from thinking they were some sort of possible North American ape to some sort of hairy hominid, all the way up to my final conclusions, which my book's about. I'll get into this a little bit later. But during this journey, I got involved in the Sasquatch Genome study. I joined North American Bigfoot Search and teamed up with David Paulides and got involved in the study, which was one of those good and bad things as far as gathering evidence and getting the DNA study done. We got that done, and of course, unfortunately, we were savagely attacked because the results weren't what the Bigfoot world wanted to hear. And but I've been doing this now for going on 7 years, and as most Bigfoot researchers find out, once they get going, you start off with Bigfoot, and then these other things start showing up. Creatures that you can't explain, dogmen show up, gray aliens show up, orbs show up, weird stuff starts happening. So, as I went through my research and all this other stuff started happening, I started changing my opinions and based on the evidence and the DNA evidence and the other things, and making observations, you start forming your opinion about what you're really dealing with, and that's kind of what led to the writing of my newest book. And it's kind of wrapping everything up as far as my research on what I've concluded based on the evidence and my observation. And I call it the book. It's called The Nephilim Among Us, and it's based on my conclusions I lay out in the book. Pretty much, I go through and kind of lay out my case for why I think the Bigfoot and these other cryptids are the Nephilim. And, of course, a lot of people who aren't come from a Christian background are probably scratching their heads saying, well, what's the Nephilim? And lots of times if I'm dealing with a person who's, who's not very spiritual, or who, just, well, I don't believe in all that jazz. I said, well, anytime I say Nephilim or angels, just replace extraterrestrials and hybrids. And once I do that, they seem to be okay with it. So, it's been an interesting journey. and that's kind of the impetus of why I wrote the book. It's kind of like, I've come to my conclusions, and I feel like it's time to kind of put it out there for people to see. And like I said, it's based on, the evidence I've gathered, form my opinions and my conclusions based, on these things, and I kind of present my case for people to see.
Right. And you've done a great job at it too. And like you mentioned there, you have done some really scientific, good scientific research with like Melba Ketchum on the genome study, where you were collecting DNA and analyzing this DNA, and then also you have worked with David Paulides too, and I thought that was fascinating because the only Bigfoot he said that he ever saw was with you.
That's correct. I go through it real quick. He'd come out. He'd come out to visit, and he was just starting his Missing 411 series, and so there was some the Tranny Gibson case and a couple other famous cases, in here in the Smokies. And so he was kind of doing a combo. He was coming out. We were going to do a little Bigfooting, and he was also going to do some investigations, and some interviews on that. And so we went out to one of my research areas. I believe it was in October, and we were going back into an area, kind of a pretty remote little area, pretty thick. And it was just a warm afternoon in October, and we were just kind of doing our own thing. I had the camera, and I wandered off probably 30, 40 yards from him, and he was following a creek, and there's a heavy laurel thicket around that creek. And what happened was he was just kind of looking around. He kind of squatted down, and he looked across the creek, and probably 20 feet from him, he spotted it. There was a Bigfoot squatted down, just staring at him. Yeah. And at first, he didn't want to believe it, and he kind of looked and kept looking. And then, he realized, oh my gosh, this is a Bigfoot. And he was trying to get my attention, and not look away, because he knew what would happen if he looked away. But I just knew if I looked away, he'd take off. And finally, I couldn't hear him, and he was afraid to really scream or yell. And he finally turned his head and said, "Scott, get over here." And of course, as soon as he said that, turned back around, the foliage was moving and stuff where it had taken off, but it wasn't there anymore. And that's the first and only time he'd ever spotted one. And he described it. He said it was because it was he could see the outline. He could see it from like the chest up. He could see the almost entire face. And he said it had a real dark set of eyes, no hair. It had the pronounced brow, deep set eyes, and then there was no hair on the cheeks. So it gives this Coke bottle or this round effect to the eye, the eye area. And then the rest of it was just covered in hair. And he said it didn't blink, didn't move. He said it was just sitting there staring, just literally just looking right at him with nothing, just looking. Wow. And so, he had time with it there. He just kept, talking to himself, and I think at first he wanted to talk himself out of it, but he finally just admitted to himself what he'd seen. Because it happens to a lot of people. The first time you see one, it's almost like, it takes a minute. It takes a little bit for that to sink in.
Yeah, yeah, because your mind really does go into every other possible something that it could have been,
Yeah.
The first time I ever had an encounter, it took me several months to admit that, that's what happened. And I got kind of a brief glimpse of it going from one tree to another tree, and it was kind of back in a place that was shaded real good, so it wasn't like real clear. But the thing pushed like 4 trees over, and was throwing stuff at me, and the dog was hiding in the tent, and all of that. It's like, okay, well, I didn't talk about it for a while. And the guy that was camping with me, I didn't even mention it to him. I didn't know what to say at first. It's unbelievable that these things are out there. It's hard to even come to terms with that they really are there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting in my research. I've had more than one person say, I've never seen a Bigfoot, but the picture you have isn't one. And I always chuckle at that. So you've never seen one, but my picture's not one. So, so if there's even that cognitive, what they call it, cognitive dissonance, where, they just cannot believe what they're seeing. And so they have to deny it. It's like, well,
yeah.
I don't know what Bigfoot looks like, but that can't be one. And so some people just can't get over that.
Yeah.
Can't get over that.
And also, I think that where you have went with your research, the people that even know that there are Bigfoot, it's hard to go from that to where you went.
Yeah.
With the, where the evidence took you, and I know researchers that are really scientific about their research, and whenever they get strange things caught on camera, they delete it, and and they hide it, and they don't want to let people know about that type of stuff, but it's not really that unbelievable when you just take the emotion out of it and just look at what the evidence, and of course when you look at the scriptures, and know the Bible fairly well, then you can kind of piece this together, and it's not really even that unbelievable anymore. There are things that go on in this world that are just beyond comprehension if you don't think in a biblical worldview, because it just doesn't seem possible. Now, your first encounter was when you were fishing. Can you kind of give us a quick version of that?
Sure. That was I had an encounter as a child, but as a first modern encounter, so to speak. I was fishing. I had started watching these videos posted on YouTube about Bigfoot research just during my lunch hours, just to pass the time. And I had seen some of these yahoos. They were, doing the whoops and stuff, and I kind of thought that was funny. And so I was fishing. It was a Saturday morning. It was a beautiful day, and I was throwing some topwater. And on this point, off of a recreation area, it's about 1,500-acre public area. It's hunting, and you can hunt on it, ride horseback, that sort of thing. And how I was sitting there fishing, and up just struck me, to do some whoops. I was stupid. So I just did some silly whoops. Good grief, they were probably, I was kind of, after I did them, I looked around, make sure, I could hope nobody heard that. I probably made one or two more casts, and then I heard something coming down the woods. And you could hear it far off, but get closer and closer. First, I thought, well, somebody on horseback. And, the end of this point is extremely grown up. It's full of briars and bushes and brambles. And, there's no, and as it gets closer, it's definitely something bipedal. It's not, I know what a horse sounds like when someone's riding a horse. And I mean, it was just tearing things up. It was just, thrashing and stomping, and it came all the way, and by this point, now my heart's going 90 miles an hour. I froze it, the lure's halfway back to the boat, and I'm just sitting there as dumbfounded, staring into the woods, and wondering what in the world is going on. And whatever this quote thing is, it comes down. Of course, the sun is coming up over the hill, so it's in my eyes, and the shoreline is dark. The back of the woods is just basically black. You can't really see back in the way the sun's coming up over the tree line. But you can hear something, and it gets to the water's edge, and then it starts going pacing. It goes up and down. You can just hear it crunch, crunch, and then every now and then you hear a limb snap or something like it's moving. And at that point, I'm kind of finding the trolling motor and backing off the shoreline because I'm thinking, my goodness, maybe I'm just a tad close to the shore. And so I start, I hit it once or twice and to kind of push the boat a little bit back off the bank. And then I'm still listening. And every now and then you can catch movement, but you can't really see what it is. And then finally it stops and it makes almost like a sigh, kind of like a hump. I'm not going to do it justice, but it's like a hump. And then maybe 3 or 4 of them. And then whatever it was slowly walked back up the point and back into the woods. Of course it was just a slow, like casual walk off. And, and this all probably took a couple minutes, maybe 3 minutes to happen once I, started coming into it. I could hear it. And so I was just sitting there dumbfounded, on the lake saying, what in the world is this? What in the world would respond to some silly whoops, I mean, they were bad. So that piqued my curiosity. That's kind of what got me hooked. And I thought, I've got to go in there, figure this out. I mean, at first I was scared, and the more I thought about it, because I just never really put together, the Bigfoot thing, it's really real and all that stuff. So that got me hooked. And a week later, I grab a video camera and I hit the woods, and that kind of, the rest is history, they say.
Yeah. Wow. And you said you had one when you were a child?
Mm-hmm. And actually this kind of helped me come to grips with what as a child, I guess it was in the early 70s, 71, 72-ish. And we lived in rural East Tennessee. We lived on a dead-end road. We were surrounded by farms. There was like 3 other houses, and then we were in the woods. Woods and fields, little farms. And it was back in the day. We lived on 4 acres and had a nice little house. And it was during the summer. It was late in the evening. I remember Johnny Carson was coming on at 11:30 at night. The news had gone off. My dad worked shift work, and I was on the couch with my mom. And she said, I'm going to take the garbage out. Back then, your garbage, we've had those big 50-gallon drums, and you'd put the garbage in those 50-gallon drums at the back. We had it at the back of the lot, probably 50, 25, 30 yards from the house, 300 feet back from the house, And for those days, the garbage men would actually drive their little garbage truck into your yard and dump it. Full service back then. But mom said, you just lay here. So I was laying. We had a rectangular den, and the couch was on one end. On the far end was the TV, and then the door. It was a screen door with a glass door too. And so Mama opened the door, turned on the light, and she went down and off the porch with the garbage. Well, just a second or two after she left, these 2 little monkey-looking things, all the way I can describe them, ran up on the back porch, laid their faces against the glass, and put their hands up on the glass and kind of mushed their noses against the glass and stared at me. Wow. And the only way I can describe them is they kind of were orangutan looking, but they didn't have, they had wild, disheveled hair, but their faces, they had like regular human noses. And, they had wide, flat mouths, way wider than normal. And one of them, I'd say, was probably 4 foot, maybe 4.5 foot tall, and the other one was, maybe half a head smaller. And at first, it just scared the living daylights out of it. And then they looked at each other, looked back at me, and they smiled. Now, a lot of people told me, well, that could have been an evil smile, that could have been stress, whatever. But they smiled at me, which for some weird reason made me feel better. Yeah. And then Mom, she dropped the lid on the 50-gallon drum. And of course that made when that made that sound, they jerked their heads around and they turned and ran off the back porch. And when Mom got back in, I do remember she talked about there was a skunk smell. She said there must be a skunk out there. And I said, Mom, did you see those two monkeys? She looked at me. What do you mean, two monkeys? I said there were two monkeys on the back porch looking at me while you were down there taking the garbage. And she said, oh, that's your neighbor, Charlotte and Chucky. They're just playing a game on you. Well, my neighbor, Charlotte and Chucky, are blonde, or both co-headed blonde, and trust me, I know if they were looking in it. So she just, we just slept. I told her about it. She doesn't even remember. It's one of those things that adults wouldn't even remember. Mm-hmm. But for years, I had nightmares about that. Just all through my teenage years, up through my early 20s. I didn't know what I saw. Were they, for a while I thought maybe these were aliens. I didn't have a clue. And then it wasn't until later in my life when I started, some of the Bigfoot shows and the Monster Quest shows started coming out, and people started actually either describing or showing pictures of infant Bigfoot, and it finally clicked in my head. Oh, well, that's what I saw. And then after that, everything was fine. Once I could put a identification on it. But back then, I had no clue. I had never even heard of a Bigfoot. That time.
Yeah. Well,
so
that's interesting, man.
that was that experience, and so I get and so, but the other one was the one that got me started. This research arena.
Right.
And once you get started, it's almost like you get sucked in.
Yeah. So you're closing in on your information, and it gets more and more interesting, and the more questions you end up with, and but it's fascinating how you have come the full circle of putting these things together, and you've been down the rabbit hole pretty far there. And,
yeah.
But yeah, the two of them, the little infant, or juvenile, or babies, or whatever you'd call them, that's fascinating. I had this one guy come on, and he played with some when he was a kid, and his story is just it's intriguing. It almost where they looked at you and they smiled. It almost seems like there's something different about them when they're little. And one of the reasons I say that is because he said that the one he played with told him that it was going to have to go away, and then he was like, well, they were communicating some way, and he's trying to tell me how they communicated. It wasn't exactly in English, so to speak. It was kind of like pictures, like drawing in the dirt, and some talking. And he had a hard time explaining that, but it wasn't like mind speak or anything. It was a kind of combination of communicating the best you could, and he was able to understand, fairly well. But this thing told him that it was they were going to have to go away, and the mom and dad Bigfoot didn't like this little female Bigfoot playing with the humans, but she said that she wasn't going to be able to see him anymore, because after a certain point I can't remember how he said it, but they said that something happens to them and they change.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to make of that for sure. But when you talk about, two little ones looking in, smiling at you, I've heard that before. But then, when they grow up, it's not necessarily like that no more, you know what I mean? So it makes you wonder what changes.
During my research, I've had reports, and working with David, I get reports, he shares reports, and we've had more than one report, especially families that live in rural areas, that the mother, she'll let the children go out and play in the yard, and she'll be looking through the kitchen window, keeping an eye on them. And on one occasion, the moms looked out to see the children playing with a infant Bigfoot. Of course, the mother gets horrified, and, and so as soon as the mother runs outside, the Bigfoot takes off. But, had no problem coming out and playing with the human children. So, it seems, and we get into it later in our discussion, but it seems like there's a set of rules that they follow, and though they're not absolute rules, there are always exceptions. In general, they follow a set of rules, and one of the rules I have found is that infants can play with human children, and sometimes even infants can play with human children with a mother, there, so to speak.
Right.
But if a human male is in the house or near, they won't come out. That's one of the rules most of the time.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they pretty much adhere to that rule. You'd be surprised how many stories either children or women with children will see the infants, but if the man's home or the man's around, it doesn't happen.
Wow, that's interesting, because I know of another story from Australia, and this girl, or I think it might have been a guy, he was playing with these things when he was little, and it was only when his mother was at home. Of course, she wasn't seeing this, but she's he was talking about playing with this little thing, and his mom would be at home when he was playing with it, and then the Bigfoot mom would be in the woods watching. So they even allowed it. But yeah, I don't believe I've ever heard of a. See, that would even fit the hierarchy biblically with the head, what I'm saying, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Certain things that you can't do, lines that you can't cross, and um, some people might know what I'm saying there, but there's a hierarchy biblically with the head, of a house, and the man being the high priest also and there might be something to that part of the scenario that. But yeah, there seems to be rules that fit almost the exact same way as you would think of when it comes to fallen angels and demons. They apply over to this Bigfoot. So let's get into your, some of the stuff that your book is about on the
Sure.
the Nephilim theory and things like that, and
Okay.
the rules or whatever you want to talk about.
Okay. Well, it's, I was kind of, as I start, was getting into my research, and like I said at first, I thought the Bigfoot was just, regular. It was either a hairy ape, some sort of unknown North American ape, or it was some sort of missing link, so to speak, a hairy hominid, some sort of, creature, that had human life that had survived in the wilderness. That was the premise, I think most Bigfoot researchers start off with. And then even from the beginning, on my first real encounter with them, and then I didn't see any, I got hit with infrasound. And so, even right out of the gate, I got hit with some stuff that was kind of odd to begin with. But, of course, everybody, they make the argument that infrasound's something that other creatures like, tigers and whales and other creatures, elephants could make. So, that's not like, out there. But about a year into my research, certain things started to happen that were very odd. One of the first things I discovered, quite by accident, the back trail camera concept, or the concept that you film where you're not looking. Actually, by accident, I established a feeding station, had found an area that I actually think they invited me to start using, and so I was doing the feeding station thing, which was the standard research thing to do when I first started. You'd you would get a place and you give them food, and they would give you gifts, and then you'd set up cameras, and you'd try to get cameras or footprints for get some evidence that way. So that's kind of how I started. That's what I was doing, and I had at the time I was just still holding the camera in my hand, and I'd been over to do some stuff in the area where I was feeding them, and I was holding the camera like under my belly, shooting and pointing it to the left. Well, when I got home and reviewed the camera footage, I noticed that this creature, this Bigfoot, stuck its head out and looked at me for just a few seconds, and then of course I moved the camera around and it was gone. And that was kind of a clue to me. So I thought that was interesting, that when I obviously wasn't looking, and this was, almost, to my side and rear. So I got the idea, well, I wonder, because at first I thought, most people just walk around the woods with a camera, and wherever they're looking, that's where they're pointing the camera. And so I started working with rigs to film what was behind me. And once I got that kind of perfected, that's when I started actually getting some pretty good footage of these things. And excuse me, cut that out. I started getting some pretty good footage of these things, lurking behind me. Because I found that wherever you're looking, they're going to be hiding. And then when you turn your back on them, they would peek out or look at you, that sort of thing. And so, they were pretty much just watching you, and they definitely weren't going to expose themselves or move while your eyes were focused on them. So that was kind of the first clue. Okay, there's something going on here. And then so, as it progressed, I found that they could use language. I had used some methods. I was just trying some different things out, and I found that they could use syllabus, and they sent me some messages using syllabus. So that was kind of another clue. Okay, it's not just dumb apes now; they're using syllabus, and so I started doing little experiments to test their how intelligent they were. So while I'm doing all this, I'd say it's about a year in my research at my house, I start noticing some odd things start happening. Feathers keep getting left beside my truck. I had a driveway I park, when I go out in the morning, there'd be a blue jay feather beside the driver's side door. Well, that's not anything, but there's blue jays in the neighborhood. It was just a coincidence. Well, the next morning I go out and there's another blue jay feather beside, the driver's side door. So now I'm thinking this is weird. So I move my truck. I park it in a different place. Then the next morning I go out and there's a blue jay feather, just one beside my truck door. So that kind of clued me in. Okay, it's once is coincidence, twice is, enemy activity. So that kind of clued me in. Something's going on. And then footprints started showing up, usually a single pristine footprint in the backyard. And of course everybody at that time thinks I'm crazy, because I live in a neighborhood, even though I live in a small town and we're not very far from the woods, it's still a small town, streets, I live in a neighborhood. I've got houses behind me and beside me. So, the logic is, how in the world are they getting to your house, getting through that neighborhood, and then leaving a single pristine footprint in your backyard? So, then I started, there was an instant where they actually robbed a robin's nest of its eggs, and there was there's handprint on the side. I had the siding on my house was oxidized. It's aluminum siding, and the paint was getting oxidized, so it was the perfect medium for them to leave a print in. So I got a pristine handprint. You can see where one of them leaned its shoulder up against the side of the house, while another one got on top of its shoulders to get to the eggs, and you can even see the hair pattern in the shoulder, about 7 foot up on the side of the house. So all this starts happening, and my head's spinning trying to figure this out. Normal researchers, your quote, when I say normal, I guess you're mainstream or laughing at me and saying you're crazy. But, it's an interesting thing with Bigfoot researchers. There's what they'll say publicly. And then when you can get them in private and you can talk, it's a whole different conversation. And I'm here to tell everybody that the Meldrums of the world, all these big, Bendenagel and all these other guys, when, no one's looking and they're talking amongst each other, they're talking about the weird stuff, Have you ever had this infrasound stuff happen? These weird stuff started happening at your house. So they know about all this. They just don't say anything about it because it's not, for mainstream consumption. So all these things started happening, and you got to couple that with the fact that I'm a Christian, proud of it, and I'm a born-again believer in Jesus Christ. So that's my worldview, is the Christian worldview. And I began to see in my own studies almost supernatural type activities happen related to these Bigfoot. And I was also, by a year or so into it, I had also joined North American Bigfoot Search, and we had begun to try to gather hair samples, for the study, and other things. I was using candy bars and sending the candy bars in after they, bite the wrappers off, and then of course I was collecting hair, and just real fast I figured out a way to collect hair. You take packing tape, wrap it backwards around the tree with the sticky sides out, and you put something higher up on the tree, bacon grease. For some reason, they really love bacon grease, so they would lean against the tree, get the hair stuck in the tape, lick the bacon grease, and then when they would back away from the tree, of course, it would pull the hair off out of their chest or other places by the root. And that way we could get a skin tag, and then we could get, we could run some DNA on. So this is all going on, and during this period, I'm getting other reports, of weird stuff happening. People report mind speak, that these things are talking to them in their head. One experiment I did, I actually was speaking English, and I was bad-mouthing them. A friend went with me, and I told him, I said, well, I'm going to try a little experiment here. I've been kind of doing some stuff with language. And so we were walking out of the research area in the Great Smoky Mountains. I had my camera on, of course, and he had a digital voice recorder on going. And he was to my right, or I was to his right, and he was to my left, and we were walking down a trail. On the left-hand side was a small, steep hill with some rocks on it. On the right-hand side was a creek, and then across the creek was we were going kind of through like a little ravine, or as the country folks say, a holler. And I'm bad-mouthing him. I just tell him, I said, I'm getting ready to do something. I don't know what's going to happen, but I am. In English, I'm saying these Bigfoot, they're just, they're worthless pieces of asses. I'm using profanity. I'm challenging them. I'm literally, saying all kinds of things you shouldn't say.
Yeah.
And as we're walking down through there, I get hit with something. Now the Bigfoot researchers call it getting zapped. But if you've ever grabbed an electric fence as a child, it's exactly what it felt like, except worse. And I had this shot go through, hit me on the right-hand side. It came up my right arm, across my chest, and then went out the side. And it hit me so hard, I almost went to my knee. It was like, an electric, hard electric shock. And I stumbled, and I looked at my friend beside me. I said, did you feel that? And he said, no, but I heard it. I said, what do you mean? He said, I actually heard a whoosh like wind went by my face. And I said, okay. And it took a second or two, for me to recover, because it was like grabbing a live wired electric fence. So I said, well, I guess I made one mad. Now, we turned and we could not find anything. I mean, we spent about 15 minutes combing the woods, going across the creek. It's so thick, you really can't walk. You know what I'm saying? It's almost crawl through one of those thickets. And couldn't find anything, but obviously whatever it was close enough to hear me and got mad. And so and the interesting thing was the next morning when I woke up and had, when you first wake up, you have to go to the bathroom, of course. And when I urinated, there was blood in my urine. And it cleared up after about a day, but I called my friend later that day, and I said, I got to ask you a personal question. I said, I apologize. I said, when you urinated this morning, did you have blood in your urine? He said, yes, I did. So, this stuff's serious stuff. Whatever they used on me, caused me to, have blood in my urine. So you can imagine it's something internal. But one interesting thing is he sent me the snippet on his digital voice recorder. There was nothing. My camera recorded nothing other than me stumbling, talking about it. But on his digital voice recorder, when we get hit, there is an audible electric-like pop and crackle that you can hear. So whatever that burst was, the digital voice recorder picked it up as a audible crackle. It's just a pop, and then you hear like almost like it was like a pop, like a thump, it's like a, and then you heard a crackle like you would crumble up a piece of paper or something. So that's what it sounded like. So that, now I'm getting a bigger picture. Like, oh, wait a minute. So these things can understand English. They can be made upset, and then they can react. So they have, they have intelligence, they have understanding, they have will, and they have emotion. So now, the picture's getting put together. These things aren't dumb apes. And even if you want to say they're a hairy hominid, well, that's an awful smart hairy hominid to be able to understand English and get mad. So that, that opened it all up. At that point, all the cards were on the table. Whatever I'm dealing with here ain't what we thought it was. If this can happen, and then, at the same time, we're starting to get the results from the genome study, and, the results keep coming back. We have a hair that's non-human that yields human mitochondrial DNA, which comes from a woman. And then when they finally get 3 samples that have enough DNA and are pure enough, they can actually get the nuclear, because the nuclear DNA comes from the nucleus of the cell. And it's harder to get. You've got to have a better sample. Hair, it's very difficult to get nuclear DNA from a hair tag or a hair. So you've got to have flesh, blood. So we finally got some blood samples and a piece of flesh, and they were able to get three genomes. And when they finally ran the nuclear, they couldn't find a match for it in GenBank. So now we had a human female had mated with something, it's unknown, and produced this hybrid-like creature that we call Bigfoot. Mm-hmm. And I just happened to be listening. Now some of your audience may know people like L.A. Marzulli or Rob Skiba, and these guys are Christian researchers, and they were researching the Nephilim. And I guess this is the point where I need to describe what the Nephilim is, or are, excuse me. In the Bible, and then in other books like Enoch that are extra biblical, the Bible in Genesis 6 describes an incident that happens where the sons of God, the angels, come down and they mate with women, and they have offspring. So you have a human woman and for their angel, and the first generation became the giants, the mighty men of old, and basically they began to corrupt the pre-flood world. Now, if you're looking at the history, one of the reasons they did this was in the Garden of Eden, when Satan tempted Eve, God gave his first prophecy. He said, I will put enmity between thy seed and her seed. This is a seed war. This is genetic.
Mm-hmm.
And you shall bruise his heel, and he shall crush your head, basically. So God just told the devil that through the seed of the woman, through the lineage, Messiah, my Messiah is coming, and he's going to kill you.
Yeah.
So at that point, the devil knows what the game is. So what would you do if you knew through the seed of the woman, your demise is coming? You're going to try to corrupt her seed. So hence, that's why you have the angels. That was one of the strategies. You have the angels, and they left their first estate, the Bible says. And in Enoch, that tells you that what they're called the Watcher class angels, and they came down on Mount Hermon, 200 of them. And I think with the devil's blessing or with his prodding, they made a pact, because God had already told them, do not commingle with humans, or else. And they made a pact, and they did. And they took wives, and they had children. And those children, these hybrids, became, what we know as the Titan. And God pronounced a curse on it, because this was such a abomination and a horrible deed, because what they had actually done by having children, when a human is born, a God-sanctioned, a God-created soul, a soul is created at conception, and that soul is redeemable. In other words, that's a creation of God. But when the angels mated with human beings, this was an abomination. This was a creature that was never supposed to exist. And they were unredeemable. The soul, the spirit and soul that was created by this union was not of God. So that's why it was such a bad thing to do, number one. So you created and it's not the creature's fault, okay? And so now you've created an innocent that's cursed, it's damned, that it can never be redeemed. That's number one. So the punishment for these guys was pretty bad. God basically, first of all, God told them to curse and said the first generation would kill themselves off, and the angels, and they loved their children, and so the angels would have to watch this. So that's where the clash of the Titans come from. So God caused this first generation to actually war and kill each other. Of course, they were having offspring, so there's still other Nephilim, but the first generation killed itself. Then God, in the book of Enoch, they basically put them, he basically bound them and made it so they couldn't see. They total sensory deprivation, and put them under a mountain, and they were supposed to stay there for 70 generations. And so that was the punishment, for this awful deed. But the deed was already done. So now you've got, Satan's little plan of corrupting the genome, has started before the flood. And it doesn't take about 1,000 years and just everything. And they only just did corrupt the human genome. They started corrupting the entire creation. The Bible says that all flesh was corrupt. And then in Enoch, it even goes further to say that they started, some of these fallen angels actually procreated with animals to create these weird hybrids. They were doing gene splicing. They were doing, kind of like we're doing now, creating chimeras. They had the technology then, and they were creating all kinds of stuff. So basically, by the time the flood came, only, there was Noah and his sons, and that was it. And the terrific violence, God destroyed the world and reset the clock, so to speak, to get the genome, cleaned back up. Now, after the flood, they came back, and there's a couple theories. Some people think that the angels made it again with human women and create more Nephilim. Some people go with the theory that the women, the wives of Noah's son.
Yeah, I don't believe that.
Were possibly Nephilim. I'll lean that way because of the great punishment.
Well,
I don't think the angels, even Michael said said the punishment was horrible. That no, and I,
Yeah.
so I think they, and that's
Well,
fine. You can disagree.
there's a verse in Amos. It talks about those who trying to dig themselves into the earth to escape. He said, "I know who you are." I believe, because I've gotten into the hollow earth. Not saying that the earth is necessarily hollow, but there's subterranean realms. Just for instance, if you take for instance, like when New Orleans was flooded, there was ants, like big old ant hills and stuff like that. And this flood came in, flooded the city. It was flooded for like darn, a month, But when that flood water receded, some of those ants came right on out. And I think that because the Bible says that all flesh on the face of the earth was destroyed. So I think in Amos, where it talks about those who were digging themselves in, trying to avoid God's judgment, I believe that some of them went subterranean. And like if you run water in your sink, if you don't have that little vent, it won't fill the pipes up. It won't drain at all.
Yeah.
So to me, it makes the most sense that because if God was going to save, Noah's, they were perfect in all their generations, kind of deal. You're talking about the genetic line there. I just don't see God overlooking the women necessarily. So to me, it makes more sense that because there was Nephilim in the land in those days and also after that. So we know that
they were after the flood too.
Yeah, so it makes more sense that there were some of them that dug themselves in, so they weren't on the face of the earth. And that's just my theory, because it would be hard for me to believe that. That's a heck of a thing to say that that the wives were Nephilim. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, the Bible never says that the wives are. It only says Noah and his son. So the Bible never explicitly tells you that that their wives were human. Of course, a human male and a Nephilim female can create human offspring, and they can also create Nephilim offspring. So it's possible. And I go through that, but that's my theory. I guess there are several theories, and I actually put them in the book. I tell which one I think happened and why I believe that. But the bottom line is, regardless of how they got here, after the flood, the Nephilim were back again.
Yeah.
And God, and they were in the promised land. Canaan was the area where I believe Ham. A lot of people think that his lineage is where a lot of the Nephilim came from, because Ham went and settled the land of Canaan, and that's where all the Canaanites, all these different tribes, that's where the Nephilim tribes were. Of course, while Israel was in bondage in Egypt for 400 years, the Nephilim tribes, took over the promised land and were setting up civilizations. And, the devil was, I've heard preachers say, the devil was laying a minefield, because, he knew, he knows what, he may not be God, but he knows what God has prophesied. So he knows what, the prophecy. He's been privy. So he goes into the promised land, starts, seeding the promised land with all these giants and all these creatures, all these Nephilim. Because when it, came time for the children to go into the promised land, the spies went in, and the spies, Tim gave a bad report saying, "Oh, they're giants, we are grasshoppers in their sight, in their sight, and we are there." I mean, they were, the Bible says they were as tall as the cedars of Lebanon. Well, if you do a little research, that's 30 feet. So you have 30. You have 30.
What do you make of the the huge thing of grapes they brought back? You think they were even
probably genetically modified?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Because that's fascinating. You made having a grape as big as a basketball or a softball or whatever it was. They were obviously huge.
Well, you just got to think of it as the amount of food a 30-footer would take, the amount of calories. And if you have a whole civilization, a whole tribe of these things, you can just imagine in several places the Bible says these tribes consume the land. where they began to eat each other. In other words, they were just, they ran out of food, and then they started cannibalizing. One thing about it, when you ever find these giants, you usually find cannibalism because they run out of things to eat. And, that goes back to, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman.
Yeah.
I'm going to, these things have basis in fact, I think. And so, you've got this, you've got all kinds of different, you've got the giants, you've got longnecks, you've got the elongated skull, you've got all kinds of weird, creatures and Nephilim. So when they finally, after wandering around in the wilderness, and they actually go in, God empowers them to start destroying these tribes. Now, just think about this. If you're a 40-foot giant and a 6-foot man kills you or starts killing your, they're not stupid. The gig is up. And they understand this. So they're, and then L.A. Marzulli, puts this theory out, and so do I, that there was they weren't stupid, so they started leaving. They started fleeing the promised land. They didn't want to get killed. And I think that's when you start seeing, just about this time, if you start reading history, that's when the giants showed up in North America. That's when you had giants showing up in, you had these weird creatures showing up in Europe. Some went to South America. That's when that's when these elongated skull-like creatures started showing up, Yeah, the Mayan culture and all this. So it's my theory, and that what happened was that when Israel went into the Promised Land, these Nephilim tribes fled the Promised Land, some on boats, some by, and that's how they got to North America, South of North America. The Indian legends talk about the giants. There's mounds all over the place. The Smithsonian has destroyed giant skeleton after giant. I mean, there's story after story. There's over 1,000 newspaper articles about giant skeletons being dug up.
Yeah.
And, with copper armor, copper tools, copper lances. The Indians, I've got, in my book, I cite a couple of Indian chiefs relating those verbal stories that, hey, the giants were here when we got here, and we had a fight. We always had a fight with them. They tried to, they'd steal and eat our children. They'd rape our women. It was always a struggle. And so the giants were here. Now, sometime around the time of Christ's birth, there's something happened. And one of the Comanche Indian chiefs said that the giants went back with the sky people. But something supernaturally happened, and the giant civilization just began to disappear. Whether it was a plague, whether they were destroyed by something, no one knows. But all of a sudden, it was just the Native Americans were all that were left. Right. And it's my theory that whatever this was supernatural, and some were forced into the wilderness. And this is where the Bigfoot came from. These Nephilim that were forced in the wilderness became the Bigfoot. Now everybody says, well, how did they get hair on them? Well, there are multiple cases where children, I cite in my book, there was a case in South America during the Civil War. There was a Civil War in the 90s, and it was a drug cartel type deal, and this little boy, about 7 years old, had to flee to the forest to keep from being killed. Well, he was taken in. He was literally taken in, and he lived with the troop monkeys. And when he was found, when he was about 12 or 13 years old, by the villagers, and he was completely hair, and they said literally, if they hadn't known, he looked like a monkey. He had grown spontaneously grown hair all over his body. And a French scientist heard about the story. She went to the jungle. She actually found the people that found the boy, and she actually found the boy. And when they rescued the boy and brought him back into civilization, they shaved him. They shaved him from head to toe. And once he started living back, with civilization, the hair on his head grew back, but that was it. The hair on his body never grew back. And when they studied him, they said, well, that's just the beauty of the human genome. you have markers that you have things that they can be turned on and turned off, and due to his, in his environment and the stresses around him, his genetically, the hair growth got turned on so he could survive. And then once he didn't need it, that got turned back off. And so it's my theory that, the Nephilim, or these giants being half human, they had this genetic ability just as well. And so when they went when they were forced into the wilderness to be reclusive, they then began to grow hair, just naturally as part of an adaptation. Because, they're having to live this persistent lifestyle.
When Nebuchadnezzar was, he was, wandering in the fields eating grass and stuff like an animal, and he was basically wandering around like a beast, And it talks about his hair and stuff like that, where it ended up being like quills, and almost like he went through a physical transformation of some type. Even talking about his hair, it made me kind of wonder, I wonder what that's about. It almost sounds like similar to what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been documented. When you start studying the human genome, and even animal genomes, there are proteins that can turn genetic traits off and on, and those proteins, and all this can be affected by your external environment. And the scientists know this. I mean, as they map the genome, and they're trying to figure out, that's how this came about was, some diseases happened, and they figured out that for some reason the protein turns on the gene for diabetes. So they're saying, well, let's figure out this protein that turns that gene off and on. If we can figure out the right protein to put in there, we can literally genetically turn the diabetes gene off. Okay? Well, that's the same thing with the hair growth gene and other stuff. You know what I'm saying? They can, but it happens naturally. In other words, that's something that God built in us, is to give us the ability to survive down here. It's the fact that, when we have environmental conditions, our body will put out that protein, and it will turn on the hair growth gene, start growing hair.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't happen with everybody, but there's been enough. I mean, back after the French Revolution, when they killed all the aristocrats, a lot of their children fled. And there have been many stories about the wild children in France. And they were, the children, kind of the Lord of the Flies situation, but all these children started growing hair all over their body because they're having to live out in the woods. And so it's not, there's multiple cases of this sort of thing happening. So I mean, that's my theory, and I put the documentation in the book. But that's, I think that's where some of the hair comes from. I mean, if you ask my wife, I'm half Bigfoot, but I'm a pretty hairy guy. So, and in the Bible, if you'll remember,
move to the inner city.
Yeah, there's people that were. Who was it stole the birthright? It was Esau. Remember, he put the goat skin on his arm because his brother was very hairy. Well, you know how hairy a goat skin is, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So the guy must have been pretty hairy.
All right.
So it's not a far stretch. And the other thing is, when you start, eyewitness accounts in my photo, the Bigfoot all covered in, sometimes the hair on the chest is sparser. I've had reports of some Bigfoot having little, looking more like some sort of caveman type deal with sparse hair. And then, sometimes there's no hair on the face. Sometimes they look like a Wookiee. So there's definitely genetic diversity.
Yeah.
In these Bigfoot. And so that's kind of how, and I guess the other thing to keep going about how I came to this conclusion was, it seems like if you research Bigfoot long enough, the other cryptids are going to show up. It just happens. And I had the Dogmen show up. and I was actually researching Bigfoot. I had a back trail camera on, and one of them snuck up behind me. Probably some pretty clear. It's pretty clear. I mean, and there's, you can get links to this, but it's dogman footage where this thing has its head back. It's right behind me, probably 6-7 feet, and it watches me for a few seconds. And of course, I flip the back trail camera, and I start to shift my shoulders. He ducks down, and I turn around and walk off. And of course, this was, and then a week later, I have an encounter with one where I'm stupid enough to take Dave's advice and go back in there and try to get hair samples from him. And one jumps up on the tree, and they make eye contact, and I see it, it sees me. So, of course, back then, it was taboo to talk about the dog man, and we were already catching all kinds of flack about with the genome study. So it was kind of, and please just don't say anything about it right now. Just, okay, we've got good footage of it, but unfortunately it's not a Bigfoot. So let's keep quiet. People are already jumping on us already about, Bigfoot. So you had the dog man show up. Then I had an instances where orbs were flying around me at my house. And so, then you had, that stuff start happening. I started having, one night I actually had footprints. It was when I was separated from my ex-wife. I was living alone. I thought I'd heard something. I came down the hallway. There were footprints, water footprints, okay, in my house.
Wow.
And so that's weird stuff like that, and like I said, in my backyard, I start having, they would take dog food a lot, but, I put some cameras up. Of course, they either disable a camera. I got some decent photos, I say decent, before they disabled the cameras, but you'd have the single footprints, you'd have the knocking on the windows, you'd have that. They actually left a hair. I put some tape out, and I got a couple hair samples from my house that were actually in the Sasquatch genome study that were Sasquatch hair. So they were actually coming to my house. So that, you put all that together, plus my background, because I'm trying to explain these supernatural things, these things that they're doing that are supernatural. I've never really done the mind speak thing with them. I think they tried it with me, and I just refused to let them do it. I just will not do it. I mean, they gave me headaches, and I pretty much feel like they were trying, but I denied it. And they have, part of the rules is if you tell them no, they have to stop.
Right.
Most of the time. Now, there's always exceptions to that, but most of the time. So I told them to stop, but other people were saying, look, these things were talking to me, and I'm seeing these things. And then we started having witnesses, people calling us up for help. Look, I put the cameras, we would have people call us that didn't want the Bigfoot around their house. They would be looking in the windows, they would be staring at their children from the woods, and these people, live in rural areas, and they were scared. And they said, we just want them to go away, So we'd always recommend, and I think you do too, get you some motion sensor lights and get you some cameras, trail cameras. Go to Walmart. Doesn't matter by the cheapest ones you have, and put them out on the side of your house, face them out, and that will get rid of them.
And can you explain to people about the infrared that they can't really hide, and even the supernatural realm seems to.
In my research, I've found that that supernatural things like can't hide or can't hide from the infrared light spectrum. I have read multiple times now that a lot of people are getting infrared binoculars, and then they're going out at the night sky, and they're looking up at the sky, and when you look at up there regularly, there's nothing up there except the stars. And then when they put those infrared binoculars, there's orbs and UFOs. The sky's just full of things flying around, things that you wouldn't normally see without them. People are doing the same thing with their cameras. Getting pictures of orbs, they'll take a camera and they'll take most cameras will pick up the infrared light spectrum, and so what they do at the factory is they put a filter that filters out infrared, so your pictures don't get messed up.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people have discovered how to peel that, it's actually on the lens. You got to go in there and peel it off. But they'll actually go in there and they'll take that filter off their lens, and then they'll start taking pictures. And all of a sudden, all these orbs and other weird things start showing up in the infrared. And that's the same thing with the Bigfoot. And that's one of the things I noticed is any time I put out a trail camera, they would instantly locate it. They'd usually mess with it, and then they'd either disable it or avoid it. And when I say mess with it, they would stick their eye in it. I mean, they know what they are, and they know how they operate. One time, one of them licked it.
Yeah.
Some of my best photos, and that actually happened in the Olympic project. Well, that's a weird thing. Why would they lick it? Well, that's a good question. I don't know. You have to ask one of them. But the Olympic project, one of the guys that Richard, he actually joined that. They found that they were licking their trail cameras. So out in Washington State. So so it's kind of a odd behavior, but they were doing the same thing out there. Well, I don't know. I think some of this stuff is to mess with us. I'll get into that in a minute, just to deceive. But they would mess with the cameras. Or sometimes they could see the infrared. When you have an infrared camera and it turns on for taking pictures, it has it's like it has a cone effect, and it can only illuminate so much of the darkness. And since the Bigfoot and these Nephilim creatures can see in the infrared, they'll step back to the edge of this infrared cone. And a couple of my best pictures I have of them is there's a set of trees, and these Bigfoot are looking at the camera from between these trees, and if they lean forward, they'll get close enough that the infrared, will show their faces and stuff, and then they'll back away. So they know, and they're just, so they're just staying right out of the edge of the infrared light. And so that, they know about the infrared. They know about our technology. Like I said, they'll locate it immediately. They know. The other thing is they know when you go in the woods. You're never going to sneak up on one. It isn't going to happen. I don't care what kind of camouflage you put on. I don't care what you do. The minute you get out of the truck and you step out of your truck, they know you're there. They can sense your presence, period. There is no hiding from them. The only time I've ever known of people getting the dope on them is hunters who will go in really, really early in the morning, and they'll get set up in their deer stand. And then, sometime later in the evening, a Bigfoot will walk by. And I'm not so sure the Bigfoot didn't know they were up there, but he really didn't. At this point, he really didn't care. But that's the only time I've heard of someone getting the drop on them. But that's about the only way. If you're that's in your mind, you're going to research them, or if you're even going hiking or anything else, they know you're in the woods. They know when you enter the woods. They know when you leave. And so,
yeah.
If you think you're going to put a trail camera up and get a good picture of them, good luck.
Yeah, and I think even when you go to a state park, something like that, where the people usually enter, there will be Bigfoot. I think typically, because they've been seen before, but typically they'll have one or more or whatever stationed around the entrance, like they're keeping track of who comes in.
Oh, exactly. I think what people have to realize is you've got to get in the mindset, which it took me a while to get in this mindset. One reason I wrote the book. You're dealing with a human hybrid creature. Whether it's a Bigfoot or a Dogman or whatever, some of them, their levels of intelligence are a little lower, a little higher, but for the most part, they are as smart as you are. Most cases, they're more intelligent. They have abilities that are supernatural. And I say that because if they are what I think they are, and they're a cross between angelic beings and humans, they genetically, they would pass some of these angelic powers or abilities. And of course, it depends on how diluted that is, but they have those abilities. The ability to use infrasound, the ability to do mind speak, the ability to cloak and become invisible. All these things, if you start researching angelic abilities, mimic the abilities the angels had and are actually documented in the Bible.
Yeah.
And I point that out in my book. You know, that when an angel went to get Paul out of prison, and it says that he woke Paul up and said, "Let's go." And Paul walked with him, and they literally walked by the second and the third ward, and no one saw him. And the gate flew open by itself. And Paul was like, "Was I in a dream? What happened?" I just walked out. Couldn't believe that they literally just walked out, and no one saw them. That they walked by all these guards.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously they were cloaked. They were visible.
That or remember that time where you were walking down the trail and you went off the trail for a minute and your son called?
Mm-hmm.
And you were standing there looking at a Bigfoot, and then all of a sudden you were back on the trail, and you didn't remember any of that until you were like reviewing the tape or something like that. Is that how it happened?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, missing time.
Yeah, missing time. So think about this.
Yeah, they can do that as well.
Yeah, you remember when the Elijah and his servant got surrounded by the Syrian army, and then Elijah said, "Fear not, those who are with us are more than them." So he prayed that Elijah's the servant's eyes were open, and there was a whole big army up around the mountaintops, and they came down and smote the entire army with blindness, it said. But I look at what the effects of when they got smoked. And then basically Elijah went out there and said, "The guy you're looking for is not here. Follow me." And he led the whole army over to Samaria, where the king was at the time. And then he said, "God, please open their eyes." And once their eyes were opened, they were all like, "What happened? How did we get here?" It basically was an abduction of the entire army. So that I think they might, even on some cases, it could be cloaking, but it also could be smiting them with this infrasonic or ultrasonic or some type of something that would cause them just to not notice, or pay, what I'm saying, to forget. Or
no, I agree.
Because your case there made me really think about it because of what you had happened. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. That's the other thing. There's the missing time thing. There's several of these abilities. From the cloaking to the missing time, to the infrasound. I cite the incident where it was the one incident where I call it the sneering Bigfoot, and I literally see a Bigfoot, take video of it, and then inexplicably stop, turn around, and walk away. And I have no memory whatsoever of the incident. And when I got home and, I was reviewing my tape, the incident, I saw it on the video, and then as soon as I saw it, the memory came back. And that's not the first time that's happened to me. It's happened to me a couple of times where, that's why I never turn off my video camera when I'm in the woods. It's done all the time. Never turn it off.
Yeah.
And there's been probably 4 or 5 occasions where I will be watching a video and I'll see something I have no memory of. They're hitting me with something that's causing me not to remember. And they can actually, the scary thing is they can actually drop suggestions in. Like when I was filming this Bigfoot, I'm zooming in trying to get a better picture, and then all of a sudden I just stop what I'm doing, turn around and walk off.
Yeah.
Why? Obviously I saw it, so they actually were able to insert a thought or influence me like the old Jedi mind trick type deal where, you just need to walk away. You didn't see anything.
Yeah. And that fits a lot of times, even with people who have seen like the UFO type stuff, that there will be thoughts thrown at them that will be like, you didn't see what you just saw. I mean, almost they can tell you what the thing was trying to say. And that just matches abilities that angelic beings have. Because every time someone was smoked in the Bible, and they name it a lot of times blindness, but the effects is what I was interested in. What did it do to them? Sometimes it would inhibit them physically, where they would try to weary themselves to get to the door, or it would smite them with the spirit of fear, or madness, or just all kinds of different things, or like forget, and it was turned into an abduction scenario kind of thing, or so that's just fascinating. And that's where the evidence seems to be. I've had people say they got hit with a roar and it made them go to sleep. They could not stay
Mhm.
awake, and that's a pretty good tool to have. Do you think that, I'll ask this question. In Revelations, it talked about at some point that there's a beast that comes out of the pit, and he's given given charge over the beast of the earth, and he's going to be allowed to kill a fifth part of mankind. Now, when I was thinking, okay, would a Bigfoot and Dogman and stuff like that be considered beast of the earth? Um, and does it match up with anything that we've gathered? Um, Now, you talked about them being on the edges of society, not necessarily way out in the woods and things like that. So, could you kind of go with that idea and
Sure.
elaborate on what you see seems like that they're doing, like gathering intel, or.
Well, it's there's several things I can pull into this. It seems like in my research, the old guard Bigfoot researcher said, "Oh, you have to go way out in the wilderness to find these things, yada yada yada." But I was discovering them just right outside of, just right outside the cities. Anywhere there's a place to hide, it's big enough to sustain them. It's 1,500 acres here, the little state park here, the national park. They literally are just right outside or on the fringes of our society. And at first, especially when you look at the Indian civilizations, uh, you know, they kind of did the same thing with the Indians. They were on the periphery. They watched the Indians, and some cases they traded with them. In other cases, they warred with them. But they were right on the fringe. And then when we, of course, came, we came to the continent, they started doing the same thing to us. And at first, I thought, well, that was just part of what they are. But then I began to think, doing the research in the Bible, are they being pre-positioned for an invasion? Because the two are kind of the same thing. And right now, we talk about rules, and they follow rules. And I've, through my research, I started, through my personal experience, and then other people, reports and the behavior, you start to gather a profile that they have some rules they follow.
Mm-hmm.
And though, like I said, these rules aren't set in stone, because every time I say there's a rule, someone will say, well, blah, 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 But,
Yeah.
for the most part, they follow these rules, and someone enforces these rules. The rules, are kind of like, they can't show themselves to a human male, unless it's just, unless it's last resort. There's some positive rules. You can, interact with a child, a female. Most of your full body daytime sightings are reported by females. A female alone in the woods is more likely to see one. So you have these sort of rules. Now, of course, every now and then somebody will say, well, hey, I was a guy, one step out for the me. And that's fine. I mean, that even though that quote breaks the rule, there are exceptions. I also wonder, well, if one steps out in front of you, most likely there's 4 or 5 behind you trying to get out of the way. Usually I find that if they break the rules in some way like that, it is a diversion. I've always told people, if for some crazy reason you see a Bigfoot out in the open and he's right in front of you or steps right out in front of you, you better turn around and look behind you if you can, because something's going on behind you that they don't want you to see. And they'll use diversionary tactics like that. But, they are these sets of rules, and I list them in my book and kind of give a little bit of backup of why I believe these rules are there. And based on, it's the same thing in these rules kind of bled over with the supernatural. You know, as I'm doing this research, I actually had a woman that did supernatural research about ghosts. She wanted me to take her out, show her how Bigfoot thing works. She was willing to pay me, yada. I'm sure I'll take your money. But as I'm talking to her and I'm showing her how I do Bigfoot research, all this stuff started bleeding over. You know, you have to be careful, they'll follow you home. You have to give them permission. I mean, all of a sudden, you know, I started to see, well, this is odd, because about half of the things that happened to these people who were researching quote code are happening to people who research Bigfoot. And then when I with keeping an open mind, I actually have a video where there's a gray alien type creature with the Bigfoot. And I've got photos of that, and I've put that video out. But so then that kind of blew my mind. So now, you know, when you start doing research, you see a certain percentage of Bigfoot encounters have an alien associated with it. You know, whether, there are some abduction people that said, yeah, when I was on the ship, I looked over and there was a Bigfoot-like creature. Or I saw this UFO land and these Bigfoot ran off the craft and ran into the woods. So now I've got ghosts and supernatural things. I've got Bigfoot, and now I've got gray aliens. They're all three kind of, the lines start to blur.
Yeah.
You know, that's when, you know, it all starts coming together that maybe these aren't, you know, these things are all related, and there's something going on with this whole cryptid thing, and maybe it's all one big thing instead of the individual thing. Yeah. And that kind of ties back into what you were talking about. You know, these creatures, I think, are being created, and they're being pre-positioned for some event in the future. Of course, being, you know, with our Christian worldview, you know, we believe in the end times that, you know, these creatures are going to be loose on civilization. But right now, they're pre-positioned, but they have to hide and they have to follow these rules where they can't, you know, they have to, interaction is, you know, limited. But with that, let me, you know, we've talked about this before, but here's where I'm going to insert a big but. Here's what I think makes Bigfoot research and all this other stuff dangerous, and I think there's dangers people don't realize. You know, it's going to upset a bunch of people because the Finding Bigfoot crew and all these things have made Bigfoot research seem like a thing you do on Saturday afternoon. And you take your children and the dog along. I'm here to tell you that you're playing with fire, and here's why. During our research, in 2 different instances, we were told by, basically what happened was one in Texas and one in the southeast, I think it was Alabama. We had children of Green Berets. In other words, the Green Berets are sworn to secrecy, so they're not going to say anything. But it's interesting, you see this with other conspiracies, but it seems like the fathers will tell the children, when I die, tell this, okay? Yeah. That way they can keep their secrecy oath, but get the information out because they think it's important. In 2 instances, we had very similar stories, that basically these Green Berets were part of teams that did operations inside the continental United States. And here's how the scenario played out for both of them, just different areas of the country. And I'm going to use, this is not where it happened, but I'm going to use an example. In upstate New York, in a rural town, children and women and or just people in general start going missing in this little town. All right, the sheriff, they start looking for them, and all of a sudden they get a call, hey, man, we found something really weird out here. So they go out the woods and they see an area, and there's human remains and bones and stuff scattered all over the place. In other words, someone's been cannibalizing humans. And, sometimes one of the instances, they even reported a fire, that they had cooked them, and they had chewed them and broke their bones apart to get the marrow out, okay? It was gruesome scene. So of course, the local sheriff's departments freak out. And they're like, we can't handle this. FBI. You know, we got a serial killer. So they call in the FBI. Well, the FBI has a protocol. And when the FBI begins to investigate and they start finding evidence, this is some sort of creature, Bigfoot, then they bump it up the chain and they call in the Green Beret team. And the Green Beret team does this. They've been doing it for many, many years. And so they come into the area using their technology, infrared, etc., and they find the clan of Bigfoot that's perpetrating this, and they kill them, and they take their bodies out and take their bodies away. And so, and then they put out the cover story. They find a taxi, or they say there was there's a devil worshiping cult here, demonic cult, Satan cult, and we've cleaned it up and we've captured them and we're going to put these people in jail. Don't nothing here. So that's happened twice. So these things can be extremely dangerous. And let me relate a couple more stories to you, especially for the women out there who like to go out and camp by themselves and want to research by themselves. This story I'm about to tell you is true. I've talked to the woman a couple of years ago. The woman basically contacts North American Bigfoot Search. I get her name and I make a phone call. Basically, she was in I'll throw out Michigan, somewhere in that area. And she had moved into a house. She owned it. It was about 40 acres. There was a farmhouse, and then behind her farmhouse was a large field. And then across this large field was a wood line. But when she called me, she was excited. She had just wanted to talk to somebody, and she found the website, so I called. She said that on the back of the house was a porch. She had noticed her mother was on the back porch waving, just waving across. At this time, it was winter time. There wasn't any crops in the field. And she was waving at something in the wood line. She says, "Mama, what do you do?" She said, "I'm waving at that big hairy man over there in the woods." And sure enough, she said she looked across there, and there's this Bigfoot, right back in the, you could see him, and he was standing there, and the mother waved, and the Bigfoot waved back. He was all excited, and I said, I told her, please be careful, you got to be careful about these things. I said, I would, please don't feed them, keep your children close. I said, are you married? She says, no, I'm divorced, and there's me and my mother and my young son. And, and I gave her the warnings, please, don't feed them, don't da-da-da-da-da. And she said, okay. I was just wondering, and I said, okay, good. So I hadn't heard from this woman at all, and I guess it's in September, probably late August, early September. And it's about 10 o'clock at night. My phone rings, and it happens to be this woman. And she is panicked, and she is hysterical. And I'm like, and she said, "You remember me?" I said, yeah, you, that lady that saw the Bigfoot across the field. Yeah. She said, I need your help. She said, I just don't know what's going on. I need your help. And I said, well, calm down. What's going on? She says, I needed some extra money. So a local farmer, offered me, I leased my field out. And this local farmer, he planted corn on that 40-acre plot behind my house. And the corn, we have a backyard. She said the corn, comes right up the edge of the backyard. She said back in the summer, when as the summer went on, the corn got higher. We started seeing we supposed it was the Bigfoot, and they were coming close to the house, and we could see their eyes glowing. And every now and then we'd see one, and we just thought it was great, and I'd look out my kitchen window, and I would see their eyes glowing, or I'd see one looking out, it was just something we did. Sometimes we sit on the back porch and watch it. She says, I was doing the dishes, and I heard, she said, she had a wind chime on the edge of her house. On the left, if you went out back and faced the corn, she said it was on the left. Of course, you got to imagine they've got a back porch that goes the entire length of the house. And then in the center, of course, is the steps, like 3 steps, I think she said, that went down. She said, something is, the wind chimes just constantly tingling, like something's ringing. So she said, I step out of the house, and I look to the left, and there standing is an older, like a gray-colored Bigfoot. She said 8 to 10 foot tall, and she said it's weird because he's completely motionless and staring around the edge of the house, except the fact that he's got his finger, on the thing, and he's actually ringing the wind chime. He said, so while I'm taking this all out, and she said, something catches my eye from the right. And when I turn around, another Bigfoot, a smaller one, she describes it as a younger one, had come around the corner of the house and was walking towards her. Now she said, I'm on the porch. There are 3 steps down, and this guy is right beyond the steps. That's how close he is. She said, he doesn't ever look at me. It's always profile, but he slowly walks deliberately across in front of me. She said, when he gets up in front of me, I can see that he is completely and totally aroused.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. She said, horrible, but, it's obvious his intentions, okay?
Yeah.
She said, no doubt. And she says, then he continues to walk. He walks around the backs. He walks around the big 10-footer. And then after he goes around the 10-footer around towards the front of the house, the Bigfoot that's ringing the chimes stops ringing the chimes, puts his arm down, and then he steps away. And literally, she calls me right after this happens. She is in a total, complete panic. And I'm like, I calmed her down. I said, well, here's what I said. When's the guy going to take down the corn? She said, well, the corn's not ready. I don't know. He said, late September, early October, blah, blah, blah. I said, I would encourage him to have him cut down some corn closer to your house. In other words, get the corn away from your house. If you can, if you'll do it. I said, you need to go out, get some trail cameras. And I said, you need to get some motion sensor lights, and you need to have them put up immediately. I said, there still no man in the house? And she said, no. And I said, well, you need to pray. And I gave her some, read the Bible. You need to let them know that they are not welcome. And I said, if you need anything, you call me back. Now, she never called me back, and I never heard anything, so I'm going to make the assumption she was able to fix the problem.
Right.
But that's not the only time this has happened. There was another lady, a young girl in her early 20s, that was married and had a couple kids, and she started posting stuff on YouTube, and she contacted me about how to do research. And I kind of warned her, you need to be careful. You don't need to be going out by yourself, blah, blah, blah. Well, sure enough, I get a phone call from her, a few weeks later. She's all upset. And she had gone out and by herself, and she was going through this property, a private property she knew, and she heard a Bigfoot often, like she was on top of a little knoll and under the hill in like a creek bottom. She heard some noise and something got her attention. She looked, and here came a Bigfoot walking up towards her. Well, when he got within a certain distance, she could tell he was aroused. And, and immediately she turned and took off running. Well, she's running. He starts pursuing her, and then another one joins the chase to her left. They're trying to literally, push her, trying to corral her. She continues to run back to her car, gets in her car, and speeds off. And the interesting thing is with this woman, she said, well, I'm never going out alone again, but she said, I guess I should have learned my lesson. I said, what do you mean, learned your lesson? She said, well, I never told you, so it was embarrassing. But she said, back before our first child was born, me and my husband went for a hike, and I was really wanting to get pregnant, so I seduced him. We made love out in the woods. And she said, of course we didn't, we just made love. It was spontaneous, so we just had to put our clothes back on, and leave with, without cleaning up, so to speak. She said, well, about halfway out, we heard something walking behind us. And she said it never would come within sight of us, but it would always stay, just with, and so she said we started walking faster and faster. She said then there was an area where you had to go across an open field. The trail went through an all open field and then pull a wood lot and then into the parking lot. She said as we began to approach this open field, they turned around to see this white 12-foot Bigfoot, she said at least 12 foot tall, was trailing them. And he said when they stopped and turned around to look, he threw his head back and was sniffing the air. And she said as they continued, then they started running. Her husband's like, go, just run, take off. And so they start running. Of course, they break across the open field. When they get across the field, they turn around and look back and said, he's standing at the edge. He won't come out in the field, but he's still standing at the edge, still throwing his head back, sniffing the air. So I don't need to tell your audience what he was sniffing.
Yeah.
So I tell you those stories for your audience to know that, these things are not the, peaceful keeper of the forest. They're just not. And these are just a few cases, that, I personally can tell you they've never hurt me or now they've made me feel very uncomfortable and I felt threatened that they ever hurt me. But these cases are women, have instances happening, and these are real people I've dealt with. And so you don't know which one you're going to run into. That's the problem. So my thing is don't be the one to disappear to find out. Yeah. Because if they get you, you'll just be like, and I'm not saying that's what does all the missing 411, that's who takes people, but I'm just saying you'll be one of those mysterious missing people that there's no trace of. So that's kind of the whole brunt of the book is I go through step by step how I came to the conclusion of what they are through my experience and through the evidence. And it's also to warn people, look, because when you start learning that they can be dangerous, you've got to tell people. My conscience just won't let me not tell people. When people call me up and say, hey, I want to start Bigfooting, I say, don't. I said, find you another hobby. Don't do it. Please don't. And I even tell, and I know I've disappointed many people that, call me up and say, let's get into this. And what do I do? And I'll tell them, you're better off not. And lots of these people aren't from a Christian background and they don't understand. And if they just insist, and I say, well, you need to go well armed. You never need to go alone. I give them the things that you need to do. And, I guess that's the whole brunt of the book is these things aren't what you think they are. And they are not as friendly as you think they are, and you need to watch out.
Right. Now, another thing that you had on your channel was a situation where you were walking down a trail, and there seemed to be like a portal opened up. And there was a big creature, kind of like a Bigfoot outline, and there seemed to be something that had a long nose, like one of those Dero creatures that I had encountered in Texas. And it makes me wonder about, when the Bible talks about the out in these desolate places where, people don't live and what have you, and that the satyr lives and the doleful creatures. It kind of makes me think about these doleful creatures. What is a doleful creature? But I had several people contact me and say, I think Scott caught one of those Deros. And when I had that encounter with this Dero, it had opened, or at least there was something there that opened a portal. Because I saw the doorway open up, and I could see as something walk into the doorway and what have you. And the Dero had this like a little wand-like thing he stuck to the side of my head, like a little looked like a grill lighter size something. But anyway, they had abilities to seemingly to open up some kind of door that is not there. And but you caught these strange kind of happenings with what seemed like a portal. Do you think that there's, because I don't remember that researcher's name he's really scientific, he wouldn't even be given to such kind of things, except he saw like a portal open up and these little creatures with glowing eyes running towards them. and they would hit it with the flashlight, and it would go away.
Yeah.
If you
That
would kind
that
of
was
tell who that is and kind of what happened, and then tell what happened with you on this portal, if you could.
Yeah, well, it was Dr. Matthew Johnson, and I believe he's a dentist, and he does Bigfoot research in Oregon, and he saw a Bigfoot hiking several years ago, and that was what got him started. But yeah, they had a nighttime incident where, if I understand correctly, they saw a portal open, and there was a little creature, some sort of little gnome-like creature, 4-footer, guarding this portal. And I think when they would they'd shine their flashlights at the portal would close up.
Yeah.
And when they pulled their flashlights away from it, it would open up. And he made a big deal out of it last year. Of course, a lot of mainstream Bigfoot researchers, lost their mind. He's crazy. There's no such thing as portals and all that, which is kind of funny because, several researchers on back channel discussions have talked about portals opening and seeing stuff they can't explain. And one incident, a guy related he saw a Bigfoot running across an open field, and literally a portal opened, and the Bigfoot went into the portal and disappeared in the middle of the field, and he didn't know what to do with that because, in his mind, Bigfoot was a bipedal ape. So he didn't understand how a bipedal ape could jump through a portal in the middle of the day in an open field. So, and so what happened, and relate that to what happened to me, and I have Dr. Johnson see my stuff. He appreciates the fact that I posted it because he thought that's very similar. Of course, it's daytime, nighttime, but kind of a similar situation to what happened to him. But and this goes back to I don't quote formally research anymore. Unfortunately, I have one of the rules. I had invited them to follow me. Now I prayed and I don't give them permission to do anything, but unfortunately they can follow me, and that's just the way the rules work. So, but I always take my camera with me, and so we're camping at a campground. This is a place where I have seen Bigfoot before, and I'm just going for a walk. And so I take my camera, I started filming backwards, and I literally walk through this spot. So I walk through where this portal opened, and after I walk by, actually as I'm walking by, you can see a distortion on the side of the trail. It's like a predator-like distortion. The light's kind of messed up, and it's not doesn't make any sense because it's kind of oval shaped, and the foliage, left and right, above and below, it's all crystal clear, and you got this distortion. And of course, I swing my camera back and forth as I'm walking, and so it's not a place on the camera. It moves around in the camera. And the camera's field of focus, so it's not like a thumbprint or something on my camera lens. But as I walk further away, you can kind of see the event horizon, I guess. You see a circle kind of open up, and then you start to see, if you're looking back, a dark thing. It's actually in the bushes, and it never really coalesces or becomes completely visible. It's always kind of see-through. A dark black figure begins to manifest in the bushes on the left-hand side of the trail. Then out in the trail, and the other side of this little portal opening, another little creature, what you call the long nose, begins to manifest as well. And then as I walk away and filming, they kind of go in and out of focus. Sometimes they get more, they get, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. They manifest more where you can actually see them better. And, in one sequence, the eyes of the little one are actually glowing. And so I've got several pictures, even though the face is out of focus, his eyes are glowing. And then there are about 2 or 3 frames where the creature materializes enough that you can actually see the entire face. And the body is still, it's like parts of it, it's like they're fading in and out of our dimension. Kind of like I walked through, either they opened a portal to look at me, or I just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were wanting to come through the portal, It was like they were waiting for me to get away from them so they could come on through. And so as I'm walking away, of course, the thing, they stay there the entire time, entire sequence. A couple minutes, they get smaller and smaller, but they're still there. And I finally, it's a long, straight stretch. And it's, I ran around the corner, of course, and turned almost a complete dog leg, a 90-degree turn. And I assume, I don't know what happened, but I assume at that point they did whatever it was they're going to do. Now, when I leave the area and I go back through the area, there's nothing there. There's no distortion. With my camera, I'm filming the same area as I'm leaving. There's nothing there. I went back. Now, I did go back, and it was interesting. A month later, we went back to the same campground. I went back to the area, and there seemed to be, even though I couldn't see it with my eyes, I did the camera. There seemed to be, and it wasn't really, you can't really post it on YouTube because I knew people would be able to see it, so I really didn't care to post it because, if it's not something that's just blaringly there, they're going to be like, oh, it's shadows, some fly flying around, something. But there was a residual, you could kind of see a spot. In that spot, there was a residual disturbance. And it wasn't near as defined, but it was weird because it was still there. So I think I contacted it. That may be a place where they, where they open a portal. And so this spring we're hoping to go back and camp there. I'll be interested to see if that residual's still there. But that kind of nailed it for me as far as these portals, because that's something that everybody's been talking about, hearing about for a while. And being a Christian, and there are two dimensions. There's the spiritual dimension that God and the angels live in that we can't see, but it's there, and then there's the physical dimension that we live in. So, and these creatures appear to be able to open portals and go back and forth into these two dimensions. So that's kind of my theory of what's going on there. And that also explains why you have footprints that go out in the middle of the field and then disappear. You have reports of people chasing the Bigfoot into a ravine, and then they got the Bigfoot cornered and he just disappears. Or you've got them showing up in odd places where there's just nowhere where they could get there.
Right.
Could they be opening portals?
Yeah, and sometimes I think they jump in trees. Now, for some people to know, to be clear about it, we think that Bigfoot has a physical body and they do eat and all that kind of stuff.
That's true.
They interact. They have knowledge and contact with a completely supernatural realm. It seems if their nuclear DNA, or their ancestors are angelic, they would retain some of the genetic traits, like vocal cords, like in when the Bible talks in Ezekiel about Lucifer's vocal cords were fearfully and wonderfully made, just pipes and timbrels, and so they would have probably some kind of vocal mechanism that would be beyond capabilities we would have, and the knowledge how to use it. And then these other creatures would probably have interest in these Bigfoot, seeing that they are offspring of angelic beings. So the supernatural realm would probably intermingle to, whatever they're doing. So portals and things like that, they may have access to things like that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't want to give, and to clarify what you're saying, the Bigfoot is a corporal creature as
Right.
far as they're physical. They do have, obviously they have hair and they have blood and they have flesh, and all those things we had during the DNA study.
Yeah.
But they eat. Obviously, they eat dog food. They eat. But they also have those attributes. Being a hybrid, they still have those supernatural attributes.
Right. Yeah.
So they are a true hybrid between the spiritual and the physical.
Yeah.
And
that gets confusing to people sometimes. Even an angel is confusing to people, and I really don't know where the ideas come from, but I know my ideas come directly from the Bible, and an angel can manifest completely into this realm and you could entertain one unaware, not even know. They can sit down and eat with you. The manna that was given in the wilderness was like a bread-like substance that you could make cakes, like a flour, I guess. That's from heaven, so we can eat their food. They can come here and eat our food. They have bodies. Now, Apostle Paul said that the glory is different. So they have some abilities that are kind of like the scripture does say, that they're made a little higher than us. So they're, New Agers would call that vibrational or something. There's, something to that. And it allows them to be able to pass through a wall. But they're still physical. They have bodies and I'm trying to be clear about those kind of things, because once you say Nephilim, they think that you're saying that they're, wispy, see-through. They relate that more to like a ghost type thing or something. And
the word Nephilim is from the fall. It means the fallen one, and so that's basically that's how God sees these creatures, because they're from the fallen ones, and they're not human. They're an abomination. So that's what that word means.
Yeah, I've heard a couple people relay stories of a Bigfoot encounter that they had, and they weren't even biblically based kind of people, but I've heard it more than one time that the person would say these things are an abomination. It's like, dude, it's a wild word to have picked, because
Well, one of my research partners, Richard Huckleberry, I put this in my book. There's a lady that does research, but she has them on her property, and their mind speak her a lot, and she relates those stories to Richard. And Richard and his wife were going to go visit her, and Richard was going to ask him questions, and I gave him some. And I've done this before to other people. I get people to call me and say, "Hey, they're on my property, and they mind speak me, and they're good." And I'll always say, "Okay, well, ask them where they came from. Ask them if they know who God is. Ask them if they know who Jesus is." And I give them a series of questions. Every one of them has always denied the existence of Jesus. They don't know who he is. All right? And anytime you're dealing with a demon or fallen angels, they'll always deny the glory of the Lord, and they'll deny his son. And Richard got out there, and he basically gave this woman the questions, and then through the mind speak, she talked to this Bigfoot. They had to go out there in total darkness. When they showed up, they heard them walking up, but they know that they have all the lights off. The Bigfoot told them that they couldn't have any electronics, no camera, no recorders. And all they could do was just sit in the dark at the edge of the barn and wait. So when they finally show up, this woman starts mind speaking the questions to the Bigfoot. And one of the questions she asked him is, "Where do you come from?" And he says, "We're your brothers. God created both of us." Right, there's his first lie. Then he says, "Do you know who Jesus is?" And he says, "I have no clue who you're talking about. I know no Jesus." And then she asked, "Are you the Nephilim?" And she said in mind speak, she said he roared at her, "No, no, no. We are not the Nephilim. We are your brothers."
Yeah.
And I thought that very telling, because first of all, they say they know God and God created them, but they don't know who Jesus Christ is. And then he did his denial 3 times. I don't know if you remember how that ties back in, but
Yeah.
When Satan said, "I'm going to ascend," he said that he did the three "I wills." I will ascend, and I will be like the Most High. And so I just thought it very interesting that he denied being an Nephilim.
Yeah, and you know what? Anything that wants to meet in the dark, there's a problem.
Yeah, and here's what, and it actually got even worse.
I don't have to meet my brother. I don't ever have to meet my brother in the dark.
That's right. And so every time, this has happened probably, I'd say 4 or 5 times. Anytime I've dealt with anybody that has one of these habituations and their mind speaking, I give them these questions. It's almost the same answer. We don't know who the Nephilim are, or we're not the Nephilim. We don't know who Jesus is. We don't know who you're talking about. But they'll say that we either came from the sky people, or we came from, or God created us, or they all, you would say, they always give deceptive answers. They never give. They're always changing their story, so to speak.
Yeah.
They're not considered. If you say, if they're all the same, they should know. Some of them say we're the, offspring of Cain, or some say that God created us. Some say that, the sky people brought us here. So which is it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you never get the same story. You never get consistency.
Right.
And so true to fallen angels and demons, they always deny Christ. Now, for your audience, and I don't know if they know the history, when we talk about demons, if you go into the book of Enoch, and I don't think it's scripture, but I do think it's biblically endorsed. Jesus quoted it. It's quoted several times in the Bible. There's, I believe, Amos actually takes a full chapter or a paragraph and literally just cuts and pastes it. So obviously, if Jesus is going to quote from it, it's something we ought to be interested in, especially from a historical point of view.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But in the book,
it's a book, from back in the day.
Yeah, but in the book of Enoch, it just flat out tells you what demons are. So basically, when the Nephilim were killed, back before the flood and then any afterwards, of course they were not human. So their soul, God cursed them, and they had to stay on earth, and because they couldn't go to hell or heaven, because their souls were not divinely created; they were abomination. So God cursed them, and they have to wander the earth in this disembodied form as demons, and they're to cause strife for human beings. That's what that's their curse. Mm-hmm. Now they can't. So they can possess bodies, and of course that's where the invitation. You can't be a Christian. You can't, because once you're a Christian, you're indwelt with the Holy Spirit. But they can take over animals, and so they're running around disembodied, trying to find a way to get into a body so they can interact in our dimension. And I've even heard I heard a preacher one time say that you've got the fallen angels in the hierarchy, and then the demons are kind of like dogs. He said they come when they're called, and they serve the fallen angels. And they do it, but here's the problem: if you've got a Nephilim, if you've got a hybrid creature, it's not human. It doesn't have any protection. I believe when a human being is conceived, there is a God-created soul that is created in the act of conception, and there's protection there. God protects that. In other words, a demon can't enter into that baby. Well, if you have a Nephilim, that is not a God-protected, God-created being. Therefore, it can be inhabited and controlled by a demon. So many people theorize that the gray aliens, some of these dogmen, basically these are avatars. If you've ever seen the movie Avatar, mm-hmm. Basically the fallen angels are literally creating bodysuits for the, for their offspring. They're now, have been,
Right.
have no body to inhabit. So, I know that's a wild, concept for some people to understand, but that's what I'm saying. When you're dealing with a Bigfoot or a Dogman or any of these other creatures, you have no idea, what their intent is, and they could be completely evil as far as their intent, and they could be being controlled by something else, something demonic. So you have to be very, very careful.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're up on a little over 2 hours. I will. Yeah. No. This. Well, I could go on 2 or 3 shows and talk about all this stuff, because I have other kind of things that I was even thinking about, but we'll call this good for now. Now I will leave all the links that you sent me. I will leave those in the description to your books, to your blog, to your YouTube channel, all that kind of stuff. So I'd encourage everyone to go into the description. I'll even put some like YouTube channel and what I can in the cards. If you touch the screen, you get a little white circle. Tap that white circle up in the right corner. They give you a drop-down menu. And then in the description, I'll have other links there. Go check out Scott's stuff. He's got some fascinating stuff, and even got some fascinating videos on his YouTube channel too. And I appreciate it, Scott.
Oh, I've enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking with you.
Well,
we always seem to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think people need to know that.
Yeah, I agree.
That, what they're dealing with. I just don't think you should send people out in the woods doing these things without knowledge, the possibilities of what they're dealing with.
Right. Yeah, especially when they can hit you with infrasound and make you have blood in your urine or forget. And yes, it's quite dangerous. Just in lots of ways, and that's certainly one of them. And then being followed home and having the marbles drop in your lap and stuff, like I've heard, people having. I think that's very dangerous stuff. So thank you, Scott, and everybody out there in YouTube land. I appreciate you listening. Go check out Scott's stuff. If anyone has something they would like to share, I'll leave my email address in the description. Also, you can contact me at brentonsawin@gmail.com. I appreciate any contributions that people give to help me keep this channel going, and the PayPal me link is in the description also. And until next time, God bless, and we'll see you on the next video.